14 years ago, they threw me out. Lillian Carter, the family disgrace. Left with nothing but their scorn, I vowed to rise. Now I'm back at my sister's perfect wedding, no longer the broken girl they abandoned, but a woman who built an empire. They sneer, they demand I leave, but I've brought secrets to shatter their lies. Tonight, their world burns, and I hold the match. Welcome to my revenge. The grand ballroom of the Whitmore estate glittered like a jewel under the chandeliers, dripping with crystal and arrogance. The air was thick with the scent of roses and champagne, the murmur of polite laughter weaving through the crowd of impeccably dressed guests. Natalie's wedding was a spectacle, an ostentatious display of wealth and status, everything my family had ever prized above all else. I stood at the edge of the room, my heels clicking against the polished marble floor, the sound sharp and deliberate. My black gown clung to me like a second skin, its sleek lines accentuating every curve I'd earned through years of discipline. A single diamond pendant rested at my throat, glinting coldly in the light. I wasn't here to blend in. I was here to break them. 14 years ago, they'd cast me out. Lillian Carter, the unwanted daughter, the blemish on their pristine legacy. At 18, I'd been left with nothing but a suitcase and their scorn, abandoned by the very people who should have protected me. My mother's final words still echoed in my mind. You'll never amount to anything. My father hadn't even bothered to say goodbye. Natalie, my older sister, had smirked as the door slammed shut behind me. They thought I'd fade away, a forgotten footnote in their glittering saga. They were wrong. Now, at 32, I was no longer that trembling girl. I'd clawed my way up, built an empire from the ashes they'd left me in. Carter Enterprises was my creation, a multi-million-dollar consulting firm that rivaled their precious clinic in influence and profit. I'd learned to wield power like a blade, and tonight I'd come to cut deep. The crowd parted as I stepped forward, their whispers rising like a tide. I caught fragments. Who is she? That dress? She looks familiar. But I kept my gaze fixed ahead, my expression calm, my stride unhurried. Natalie stood at the center of the room in her ivory gown, a vision of bridal perfection, her golden hair cascading in waves. Beside her, Daniel, her fiancé, adjusted his tie, his easy smile faltering as his eyes landed on me. Recognition flickered there, sharp and unguarded, before he masked it. Interesting. Lillian? My mother's voice sliced through the hum of the room, venom dripping from every syllable. She emerged from the cluster of guests, her face a mask of disdain beneath her perfectly applied makeup. Her silver gown shimmered as she moved, but her eyes were cold, reptilian. What are you doing here? I tilted my head, meeting her gaze with a faint, deliberate smile. It's a wedding, Mother. I was invited. A lie, of course, but the engraved invitation tucked into my clutch forged with precision said otherwise. You weren't invited, Natalie snapped, stepping forward. Her voice trembled with fury, though she tried to hide it behind a tight, practiced smile. This is my day. You have no right to be here. Get out. I didn't flinch. 14 years, Natalie, and you still think you can order me around? How quaint. Her eyes narrowed, her cheeks flushing beneath her blush. You're still the same pathetic little girl, aren't you? Clinging to some delusional grudge. Leave, or I'll have security drag you out. Pathetic? I echoed, my voice low, cutting. That's an interesting word coming from you. I let the silence hang, heavy and deliberate, before adding, Doctor. Her lips parted, but no sound came out. The title, her proudest, lie hung between us like a guillotine blade. The guests shifted uncomfortably, sensing the storm brewing. My father appeared then, his broad shoulders filling out his tailored tuxedo, his graying hair swept back in that same imperious style I remembered. He didn't look at me, not directly, just stared past me as if I were a ghost he could will away. "She's not worth it, Natalie," he muttered, his tone clipped. "Let the staff handle this." "Handle me?" I said, stepping closer, forcing him to meet my eyes. "You've spent 14 years pretending I don't exist, Father. I'm not so easy to ignore anymore." "Lillian?" Daniel's voice broke through, tentative, uncertain. He moved toward me, his brow furrowing. "Lillian Carter? From back then?" Natalie's head whipped toward him. "You know her?" He hesitated, his Adam's apple bobbing as he swallowed. I met her once, years ago, at a conference." His eyes darted to me, searching, and I saw it, the spark of memory, the thread of a secret he hadn't shared with his bride-to-be. "Daniel!" Natalie hissed, grabbing his arm. "Whatever she told you, it's a lie. She's a nobody. She's always been a nobody." "A nobody?" I mused, my smile widening. "That's not what the Forbes list says, or the IRS for that matter." I reached into my clutch and pulled out a slim silver USB drive, holding it up so the light caught it. "But we'll get to that." The room went still. My mother's hand tightened around her champagne flute, her knuckles whitening. My father's jaw clenched, a muscle ticking beneath his skin. Natalie's eyes widened, her bravado cracking. "What the hell is that supposed to mean?" she demanded, but her voice shook now, betraying her. "It means," I said, stepping forward until I was close enough to see the panic in her eyes, "that I've had 14 years to watch you, to learn every lie, every secret, every crack in your perfect little facade. And tonight, Natalie, I'm going to show everyone exactly who you are." "Enough!" my father barked, finally turning to face me. "You will not ruin this day. You're nothing to us, nothing." I held his gaze, unflinching. "That's where you're wrong, Father. I'm everything you should have feared." The tension snapped taut, a live wire humming through the room. Guests murmured, craning their necks, sensing the unraveling of something monumental. Natalie's grip on Daniel's arm tightened, but his eyes stayed on me, questioning, uncertain. My mother took a step back, her composure slipping for the first time I could remember. I twirled the USB drive between my fingers, my voice steady as steel. "Shall we start with the easy one? Natalie, why don't you tell everyone about your medical degree? Or rather, the one you never earned?" The color drained from her face. The guests gasped, a ripple of shock spreading outward. Daniel turned to her, his brow furrowing deeper. "What's she talking about, Nat?" "She's lying!" Natalie spat, but her voice cracked. Too shrill, too desperate. "She's jealous. She's always been jealous." "Am I?" I said coolly. I pulled a folded document from my clutch official transcripts, stamped and notarized, and held it up. "These say otherwise. Dropped out in your second year, didn't you? Flunked out, to be precise. But you've been playing doctor all this time, haven't you? How many patients trusted you, Natalie? How many lives did you put at risk?" The room erupted in whispers, heads turning, eyes wide. Daniel yanked his arm free from her grasp, stepping back. "Is this true?" "Daniel, don't listen to her," Natalie pleaded, reaching for him, but he pulled away, his face hardening. I didn't stop. "And that's just the beginning. Let's talk about the clinic, shall we? Embezzlement, insurance fraud, falsified records. It's all here." I tapped the USB drive against my palm. 14 years of evidence, neatly compiled. I wonder what Dr. Hargrove will think when he sees it. I nodded toward the silver-haired man in the corner, the hospital director, a key figure in their world, now watching with rapt attention. "Lillian, stop this!" My mother's voice was a shriek now, her mask shattering. "You spiteful little—" "Spiteful?" I cut her off, my tone ice cold. "No, Mother, this isn't spite. This is justice." The ballroom was a pressure cooker now, the air crackling with disbelief and dread. Natalie's hands trembled as she clutched at Daniel, her perfect bridal fade crumbling like cheap plaster. My mother's shriek still hung in the air, a desperate feral sound, but I didn't flinch. I'd waited 14 years for this moment, every sleepless night, every calculated move, every piece of evidence meticulously gathered. They'd underestimated me then, and they were underestimating me now. That was their fatal mistake. Daniel's voice cut through the chaos, low and strained. Natalie, answer me. Is it true? Did you lie about medical school? She spun toward him, her eyes wild, her voice pitching higher. She's twisting everything, Daniel. You know me, I couldn't. But her words stumbled, tripping over themselves, and the transcripts in my hand gleamed like a guillotine blade under the chandelier light. Couldn't what? I said, stepping closer, my tone smooth as silk and sharp as glass. Couldn't admit you failed? Couldn't face the truth? Or couldn't stop pretending to be something you're not? I unfolded the document fully, holding it out for the nearest guests to see. Second year, 3 failed courses, academic probation, and then nothing. You dropped out, Natalie. But you didn't stop there, did you? You forged a degree, built a career on lies, and let people trust you with their lives. A woman in an emerald gown gasped audibly, pressing a hand to her chest. Murmurs swelled into a roar, guests craning to see the paper, their polished civility dissolving into raw curiosity. Dr. Hargrove, the hospital director, pushed forward through the crowd, his stern face etched with suspicion. "Let me see that," he demanded, extending a hand. Natalie lunged for the transcripts, but I pulled them back with a flick of my wrist, handing them instead to Hargrove. "Be my guest," I said, my smile faint but unyielding. "There's more where that came from." Hargrove's eyes scanned the page, his lips thinning into a hard line. He looked up at Natalie, then at my father, who stood rigid, his fists clenched at his sides. "This is damning," Hargrove said, his voice gravelly. "If this is authentic, and it certainly looks it, there will be an investigation." "Investigation?" Natalie laughed, a brittle, unhinged sound. "She's a liar! She's doing this to ruin me! Daniel, tell them I'm not..." She grabbed his sleeve again, but he shook her off, his expression darkening with betrayal. "Don't," he said, stepping back. "Just don't." I tapped the USB drive against my palm again, drawing every eye in the room. "Oh, we're not done yet. Natalie's little charade is just the appetizer. The main course is your precious clinic, Father." I turned to him, locking eyes with the man who'd once towered over me, his silence more cutting than any words. "You've spent decades building that Empire Carter family clinic, the shining beacon of healthcare excellence. Except it's rotten to the core, isn't it?" He finally spoke, his voice a low growl. "You have no proof of anything. You're bluffing." "Am I?" I tilted my head, savoring the flicker of doubt in his eyes. 14 years is a long time to dig, Father. Long enough to find the shell companies, the padded invoices, the insurance claims for patients who never existed. Long enough to track the money millions siphoned off while you smiled for the cameras and shook hands with donors. And then there's the patient records altered, fabricated, all to cover up your incompetence and greed." The room exploded. Guests recoiled, some clutching their pearls, literally, while others whispered furiously to their neighbors. My mother swayed, gripping a chair for support, her face ashen. Natalie's knees buckled, and she sank onto the edge of the dais, her gown pooling around her like a fallen angel's wings. "You're insane," she hissed, but it was weak, a last gasp of defiance. "You can't prove any of this." Funny you should say that. I held up the USB drive, letting it catch the light again. "This contains everything: financial records, emails, witness statements. I've got whistleblowers from your own staff, Natalie. Nurses who saw you fumble procedures, administrators who watched you bury the complaints. And Father, your signatures on every dirty deal. I made sure of that." Daniel stepped forward, his jaw tight. "Give it to me," he said, his voice steady despite the storm in his eyes. "I want to see it." "Daniel, no!" Natalie cried, scrambling to her feet, but he ignored her, holding out his hand. I placed the drive into his palm, our fingers brushing briefly, and I saw the weight of it settle on him. The man who'd thought he was marrying into a dynasty, now holding its downfall. He crossed to a table where a laptop sat, part of the wedding's AV setup, and plugged in the drive. The screen flickered to life, projecting onto a massive display behind the dais. Files popped up, spreadsheets, scanned documents, audio recordings. A guest near the front gasped as a grainy photo appeared. Natalie, caught mid-lie at a supposed consultation, her stethoscope dangling uselessly around her neck. Then came the financials line after line of fraudulent charges, signed off by my father's unmistakable scrawl. The room was pandemonium now. Hargrove barked orders into his phone, calling for his legal team. Guests surged toward the exits, some clutching their coats, others too stunned to move. My mother sank into a chair, her hands covering her face, while Natalie screamed, "Turn it off! Turn it off!" But Daniel didn't. He clicked through file after file, his silence louder than her hysterics. Finally, he looked at her, his voice barely above a whisper. "You lied to me. About everything." "Daniel, please," she sobbed, reaching for him. But he stepped back, shaking his head. My father rounded on me then, his face purple with rage. "You think you've won? You're still nothing to me, nothing. I disown you, Lillian, just like I did before. You'll never be part of this family." The words hit me, but they didn't wound. Not anymore. I straightened, my voice calm, lethal. "Disown me? Oh, Father, you don't get it. I don't want your name. I've built my own. But before I go, one last gift." I pulled a final document from my clutch tax records, stamped with the IRS seal, and held it up. "You've been using my identity for your tax fraud, haven't you? Writing off losses under my name, thinking I'd never find out. The feds know now. They're on their way." His eyes widened, the first real crack in his armor. You can't." "I already have," I said, dropping the paper at his feet. It landed with a soft thud, a death knell to his empire. Security burst through the doors then, their radios crackling, drawn by the chaos. Natalie wailed as they approached, my mother shouting incoherently, my father frozen in place, staring at the wreckage of his life. I turned away, my work done, and felt a warm hand slip into mine. Marcus, my husband, stood beside me, his dark eyes gleaming with pride. He'd been my rock through every step of this, my partner, my strength. "Let's go," he murmured, his voice a steady anchor. I nodded, and together we walked out, the click of my heels echoing through the stunned silence. Behind us, the Carter family burned. Natalie's sobs, my mother's shrieks, my father's bellows fading into the distance. The cool night air hit my face as we stepped outside, and I breathed it in, deep and free. Justice tasted sharp, sweet, and final. The night air was crisp, laced with the faint scent of jasmine from the estate's sprawling gardens. The chaos of the ballroom faded behind us, muffled by the heavy oak doors that slammed shut as Marcus and I stepped into the driveway. My pulse still thrummed with adrenaline, but my breathing steadied, each exhale a release of the weight I'd carried for 14 years. Marcus's hand in mine was warm, grounding, a silent promise that I wasn't alone in this, not anymore. The gravel crunched beneath my heels, a rhythmic counterpoint to the distant shouts still spilling from the Whitmore estate. "You were incredible in there," Marcus said, his deep voice cutting through the quiet. He stopped walking, turning to face me, his broad frame silhouetted against the glow of the mansion's windows. His dark suit was impeccable, but his tie was slightly askew, evidence of the tension he'd held back while watching me take them apart. "I knew you'd do it, Lil, but seeing it, God, they never stood a chance." I smiled, a real one this time, not the calculated curve I'd worn inside. "They didn't. Not once I had everything in place." I squeezed his hand, feeling the strength in his grip, the unwavering support that had carried me through the darkest days. "But I couldn't have done it without you, Marcus. You kept me sane when I wanted to burn it all down too soon." He chuckled, a low, warm sound that softened the edges of the night. "Oh, I wanted to burn it down too. Every time you showed me another file, another lie they'd buried you under, I was ready to storm in myself. But you were right. This was your fight, and you fought it like a damn queen. I leaned into him, resting my forehead against his chest for a moment, letting the steady beat of his heart anchor me. Marcus had come into my life 5 years ago, a brilliant lawyer with a quiet intensity that matched my own. He'd seen the scars my family left, emotional, jagged, deep, and instead of flinching, he'd helped me turn them into weapons. Every late night poring over documents, every contact he'd leveraged to get me those IRS records, every whispered encouragement when doubt crept in, it had all led to this. A sudden crash echoed from the mansion, followed by a piercing scream, Natalie's no doubt. I lifted my head, glancing back. The windows framed a tableau of pandemonium, silhouettes of guests scrambling, security guards weaving through the crowd, my father's hulking figure barking orders that no one seemed to heed. A woman in a sapphire gown stumbled out onto the terrace, clutching her phone, her voice shrill as she shouted, "Call the board! This can't stand!" Another guest, a balding man in a tuxedo, shoved past her, muttering, "Fraud! I invested everything in that clinic." Marcus followed my gaze, his lips quirking. "Looks like the vultures are circling already." "Let them," I said, turning away. "They'll pick the bones clean soon enough. Hargrove's already on it. He'll make sure the hospital cuts ties by morning. And the feds? They'll be here before the cake's cut." As if on cue, the distant wail of sirens pierced the night, faint but growing louder. Marcus raised an eyebrow. "You timed that, didn't you?" "Of course I did," I replied, my voice dry. "What's a finale without a little flair?" He laughed outright then, pulling me closer, his arm wrapping around my waist. "That's my girl." We resumed walking toward the valet stand, where our sleek black car waited, its engine purring softly as the attendant handed Marcus the keys. But before we could climb in, the doors of the estate burst open again, and Natalie staggered out, her veil askew, her mascara-streaked face a mask of fury and desperation. She spotted me and lurched forward, her gown dragging through the gravel. "Lillian!" she shrieked, her voice raw. "You think this is over. You think you've won. I'll sue you. I'll destroy you. You're nothing but a spiteful, bitter—" "Save it!" I cut her off, turning to face her fully. My tone was ice, unyielding. "You've got bigger problems than me now, Natalie. Like explaining to the police why you signed off on fake surgeries, or to Daniel why you thought he'd never find out." Her mouth opened, then closed, her chest heaving. Behind her, Daniel emerged, his face a storm of conflicting emotions, anger, heartbreak, disbelief. He didn't move to help her, just stood there, hands in his pockets, watching her unravel. "Daniel," she whimpered, twisting toward him. Tell her she's wrong." He shook his head, slow and deliberate. "She's not. You are." His voice was quiet, final, and it hit her like a physical blow. She crumpled, sinking to her knees in the gravel, sobs racking her frame. I didn't linger to watch. I'd seen enough. Marcus opened the car door for me and I slid inside, the leather cool against my skin. He joined me, starting the engine with a low rumble, and we pulled away just as the first police cars crested the hill, their lights flashing red and blue against the night. The estate shrank in the rearview mirror, a gilded cage collapsing under its own weight. I leaned back in my seat, closing my eyes, letting the hum of the road wash over me. Images flickered behind my lids, my mother's sneer as she'd thrown me out at 18, my father's cold indifference, Natalie's mocking laughter. They'd thought me weak, disposable, a stain they could erase. But I'd risen from that, built a life they couldn't touch, a legacy they couldn't claim. "You okay?" Marcus asked, glancing at me, his hand resting lightly on my knee. I opened my eyes, meeting his gaze. "More than okay. I'm free." He smiled, that quiet, steady smile that had seen me through every storm. "You always were. They just didn't know it." The road stretched ahead, dark and endless, but it didn't feel daunting. Not with Marcus beside me, not with the weight of their lies finally off my shoulders. I thought of the girl I'd been scared, alone, abandoned, and then of the woman I'd become. Unbreakable, victorious. They'd tried to bury me, but I'd grown roots in the dirt they left me in, and now I towered over them. The sirens faded into the distance, swallowed by the night. Somewhere behind us, my family faced the wreckage of their making arrests, lawsuits, disgrace. Natalie's wedding was in ruins, her illusions shattered, my father's empire reduced to ash. My mother would cling to her denial until the end, but even she couldn't escape the truth now. I reached for Marcus's hand, threading my fingers through his. "Let's go home," I said softly. He nodded, and we drove on, the stars above us sharp and bright, a constellation of my own design.